Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, Context is Everything Media Network, founder and CEO, John Michael, reading a textbook cover to cover in order to establish my historical context. Today, we move on to Chapter 12, Section 4. Yesterday, Chapter 12, Section 3. In the spirit of context being everything, let me do a review of yesterday's reading. Chapter 12, Section 3, entitled Trade Routes of East Africa. Axum extended from the mountains of present-day Ethiopia to the shores of the Red Sea. The peoples of Axum were descendants from African farmers and from traders who brought Jewish religious transitions through Arabia. These merging of cultures introduced another religion to Axum. It also gave rise to the unique written and spoken language of Ge'ez, G-E-E-Z. Axum, from 200 BC to 400 AD, Axum commanded a triangular trade network that connected Africa to India by way of the Arabian Sea and to the Mediterranean world as well. Axum markets offered iron, spices, and precious stones from their native. That's what they collected themselves. They harvested that. But they also sold cotton and linens and China and stuff from the Asiatic region because they could trade with them. But let's stick to iron, spices, and precious stones because those they sourced themselves. In 350 AD, Axum conquered and absorbed the ancient Nile kingdom of Nubia. In the 300s, Axum's greatest king, Ezana, converted to Christianity. In the 600s, Islam began spreading across Africa, and since it became a Christian nation, the spread of Islam isolated Axum from important trade networks. Soon, civil war and economic decline combined to weaken Axum, and the kingdom slowly declined. Ethiopia. Again, the title of the chapter is Trade Routes of East Africa. We just talked about Axum. Now we're going to talk about Ethiopia. According to Ethiopian tradition, the first emperor of Ethiopia was the son of the Israelite king, Solomon, and his bride, Makeda. Ethiopia has remained a Christian state until the present, with the Coptic Christian Church dominating. Protected by rugged mountains, descendants of the Axumites were able to maintain their independence for centuries. During the early 1200s, Christian monks built a number of remarkable churches. They were carved into solid rock of mountains. According to Ethiopian chronicles, the builders had divine help. One Ethiopian group practiced Judaism rather than Christianity, though. These Ethiopian Jews, known as the Falasha, survived in mountains of Ethiopia until recent years when they evacuated to Israel during a famine. East African city-states. While Axum declined, a string of commercial cities, Kilwa, Mogadishu, Mombasa, Sofala, gradually rose along the East African coast. Since ancient times, Phoenician, Greek, and Roman, as well as Indian traders, had visited this coast, the east coast of Africa. Port cities, as well as offshore islands like Lamu and Zanzibar, were ideally located for trade with Asia. On the East African coast, many rulers saw the advantages of encouraging trade. ivory, leopard skins, iron, copper, pearls, and gold came from the interior of Africa, as well as from the coastal regions. From India, Southeast Asia, and China came cloth, silk, spices, porcelain, china, glassware, and swords. That's right, you got it, swords. A thriving slave trade also developed. Both private houses and palaces show strong Arab and Middle Eastern influence in East African cities. Additionally, the blend of cultures gave rise to a new language known as Swahili. It fused many Arabic words into the Bantu base and was written in an Arabic script. So Swahili is Arabic and Bantu, written in Arabic. Great Zimbabwe. Now, this book didn't have a lot of information on it, so I didn't write that much. It did write a lot about it, but it was all like, we actually don't know, they said, like 5 times. We're really not sure, they said at the beginning of the paragraph, so I didn't write that much. Today, the impressive ruins are all that remain of Great Zimbabwe. This city was built by Bantu-speaking...
Okay.
Siri. Siri just listened in. Interrupted. Rude. This city was built by Bantu-speaking people who settled in the region between 900 and 1500. 900 and 1500 AD. Yes, AD. Great Zimbabwe was part of a trade network that reached across the Indian Ocean. By the 1500s, Great Zimbabwe was in decline. Portuguese traders were pushing inland to find gold, and though they failed to find the source of the gold, their intrusion helped undermine small states, like Great Zimbabwe, that were formed in East Africa. Context is Everything Media Network, Chapter 12, Section 4, right now. Many people, many traditions. This is about Africa. So, let's start there. Chapter 12, Section 4. Many people, many traditions. Setting the scene. At harvest time, the Kikuyu people of East Africa offered prayers of thanksgiving to their traditional gods. A modern writer recorded one ancient prayer. Mwini Niyaga, you have brought us rain and have given us good harvest. Let people eat grain of this harvest calmly and peacefully. Guard us against illness of people or our herds and flocks, so that we may enjoy this season's harvest in tranquility. Jomo Kenyatta, facing Mount Kenya. That's the name of the thing that quote came from. In West Africa, Muslims recited a different prayer. Praise be to God, Lord of the universe, the compassionate, the merciful. Differing religious traditions contributed to the diversity of the vast continent of Africa. At the same time, religious beliefs formed deep bonds that united individual societies. People and the environment. Heading. Over thousands of years, Bantu-speaking people migrated across Africa. With them, they carried farming skills and knowledge of ironworking to its many regions. Ironworking, definitely important in Africa. Wherever these people settled, they adapted to the local environments and absorbed ideas from the people they encountered. Trade and other contacts brought additional changes as a result. The way of life of African society varied greatly from place to place. Hunting and food gathering. Bantu migrations pushed many hunting and food gathering people of Africa to fringe areas. The Khoisan people, for example, adapted to the harsh conditions of the Kalahari Desert by gathering roots and herbs and hunting small game. Because of food was scarce, hunting and gathering people lived in small bands, numbering only about 20 or 30. Their knowledge of the natural world, however, was unmatched by city dwellers or farming villagers. They could track animals across long distances and identify the food and healing properties of many different plants. Herding and fishing. In parts of the savannah, free from the tsetse fly, which we mentioned earlier, is really bad, the tsetse fly, some people raised herds of cattle. Because grazing areas were limited, these societies were often nomadic. To protect their herds against raiders, these peoples perfected the skills of warfare. How did they do that? Along the coasts and rivers, fish was the basic food for some people. Most fishing people used nets. They traded any surplus fish for grain, animal skins, and other products made by people who lived inland. Some fishing areas had enough food and resources to support large populations. Settled farming societies. Farming communities raised a variety of crops, from grains to root crops like yams or tree crops like bananas. Most farming people practiced a method that is today called slash and burn agriculture. They cleared the forest and brush lands with iron axes and hoes, and then burned the remains, using the ash as fertilizer. Because the land lost its fertility for a few years, villagers would move on to clear the land. Villagers would move on to clear other land. Eventually, after giving the soil time to renew its fertility, they might return to the abandoned fields. Interesting. Interesting indeed. Heading. New heading. Forms of village government. Farming people generally lived in tight-knit communities and helped one another in tasks such as clearing the land, planting, and harvesting. Both men and women planted, but they usually were responsible for different crops. Political patterns varied, depending in part to the one size of the communities. However, village governments often had similar features. Right? Sharing power. In these pre-urban societies, power was usually shared among a number of people rather than centralized in the hands of a single leader. In some villages, a chief had a good deal of authority, but in many others, elders made the major decisions. In some other places, especially in parts of West Africa, women took a dominant role in the marketplace or acted as official peacemakers in the village. Villages often made decisions by a process known as consensus. In open discussion, people whose opinions were valued whose opinion were valued voices used their views before a general agreement was reached. The opinions of older women and men usually held the greatest weight. Villages within a large kingdom, like that of Songhai, had to obey decisions made by a distant court. These villagers had to pay taxes and provide soldiers to the central government. The Kingdom of Congo. Subheading. The Kingdom of Congo, which flourished about 1500 AD in Central Africa, illustrates one of many forms of government organization in Africa. It consisted of many villages grouped into districts, provinces, and governed by officials appointed by the king. Each village had its own chief, a man chosen on the basis of the descent of his mother's family. The kingdom of Congo might seem to have absolute power, but actually that power was limited. The king was chosen by a board of electors and had to govern according to traditional laws. Unlike rulers of West African states, who maintained strong standing armies, kings of Congo could only call upon men to fight in times of need. Though local governments and kings collected taxes, either in goods or cowrie shells, a common African currency. Family patterns. New heading. In Africa, as elsewhere, the family was the basic unit of society. Patterns of family life varied greatly. In hunting and gathering societies, for example, the nuclear family was typical, with parents and children living and working together as a unit. In other African communities, people lived in joint families. Several generations shared the same complex of houses. Lines of descent. Family organization varied in other ways. Some families were patrilineal. In these families, important kinship ties and inheritances were passed through the father's side. Other families were matrilineal, with inheritance traced through the mother's side. In the patrilineal cultures, a bride would move to her husband's village to become part of his family. In matrilineal cultures, the husband joined the wife's family. Matrilineal cultures also forged strong ties between brothers and sisters. Brothers were expected to protect their sisters, and sisters made their sons available to help their brothers whenever needed. Wider ties. Each family belongs to a lineage or group of households who claimed a common ancestor. Several lineages formed a clan that traced its descendant to an even more remote and often legendary ancestor. Belonging to a particular family lineage or clan gave people a sense of community. An individual's place in society was also determined by a system of age grades. An age grade included all girls or boys born in the same year. Each age grade had a particular responsibility and privilege. In the older age grades, children began to take part in village activities, which created social ties beyond the family. Religious beliefs. New heading. Across Africa, religious beliefs were varied and complex. Like Hindus and ancient Greeks and Romans, village Africans worshipped many gods and goddesses. They identified the forces of nature with divine spirits and tried to influence those forces through rituals and ceremonies. Many African peoples believed that a single unknowable supreme being stood above all the other gods and goddesses. This supreme being was the creator and ruler of the universe, and was helped by the lesser spirits who were closer to the people. Like the Chinese, many African people believed that the spirits of their ancestors could help, warn, or punish their descendants on earth. Just as Christian and medieval Europe called the saints, people in Africa turned the spirits of their departed ancestors into veritable saints. Christianity and Islam, as you have seen, influenced people in some parts of Africa. Converts often associated God of Christians and Muslims with their traditional supreme being. In this way, Christianity and Islam absorbed many local practices and beliefs. Artistic and literary traditions. New heading, artistic and literary traditions. In art and architecture, African traditions extend far back in time to the ancient rock paintings of the Sahara, the pyramids of Egypt and Nubia, the rock churches of Ethiopia, and the palace of Great Zimbabwe bear lasting witness of the creative power of these early civilizations. Sadly, many wooden buildings and works of art have not survived. Arts. African artists created works with ivory, wood, and bronze. Sometimes their work was decorative. Sometimes their work was decorative. Artisans wove and dyed cloth, inscribed jugs and bowls, and shaped bracelets and neck ornaments simply for beauty. Much art, though, served social and religious purposes. Art strengthened bonds within their communities. Linked both the markers and the users of the work. Patterns used to decorate textiles, baskets, swords, and other objects had important meanings. Often they identified an object as a work of a particular clan or the possession of royalty. In Africa, as elsewhere, much art was closely tied to religion. Statues and other objects were used in religious ceremonies. In many rituals, leaders wore impressively carved wooden masks decorated with cowrie shells or grass. Once the mask was in place, both the wearer and the viewer could feel the presence of the spiritual force it represented. Literature. African societies preserved their histories and values through, this is the last section of the section. African societies preserved their histories and values through both oral and written literature. Ancient Egypt, Nubia, and Axum left written records of their past. Later, Arabic provided a common written language in parts of Africa influenced by Islam. African Muslim scholars gathered in cities like Timbuktu and Kilwa, as well as North African cities. Documents in Arabic offer invaluable evidence about law, religion, and history. Oral traditions date back many centuries. In West Africa, griots, or griots, Griots, pronounced griots. In West Africa, griots, or professional poets, recite ancient stories. They presented both histories and traditional folk tales as in the same way that epics of Homer and Aryan India were passed orally from generation to generation. Aryan Indian. Homer or Aryan India were passed, whatever. Histories praised the heroic deeds of famous ancestors of kings. Folk tales, which blended fanciful stories with humor and sophisticated wordplay, taught important moral lessons. Oral literature, like religion and art, thus encouraged a sense of community and common values. And as always, context is everything. Media Network, episode 64. I hope you have a wonderful day. Enjoy the weather, if it's a beautiful day by you. If it's acid raining, wear your tin foil lined hooded sweatshirts. Bye-bye. Have a good day.